Now, despite the civil war in Africa's youngest country dragging on for over 4 years, displacing nearly 2.5 million people in the process, attention is now being refocused on the very lavish lifestyles of some of the country's key political and military leaders and their dependents. In July, the UN Security Council extended sanctions on the country, and that included the former Chief of Staff for the country's army, Paul Malong. Among other things, he's accused of ordering SPLA units to attack and displace civilians while interfering with relief efforts. A documentary published in October probed his lifestyle and business links in Kenya and Uganda, even as millions face hunger and deprivation away from home across the region. Now, John-Allan Namu is the co-founder of African Censored, the company behind this investigative documentary. I spoke to the award-winning investigative journalist earlier on. I started our conversation by asking him how illicit proceeds from the conflict in South Sudan tends to filter into real estate markets in Uganda and Kenya.
If you go to certain suburbs in Kampala, you will find an overwhelming number of South Sudanese elite, political and military elite, staying within the same area, no matter what side they lie on in terms of the conflict. And it follows a very specific pattern. It's usually real estate and then movable assets like cars and that sort of thing that are the more visible things. Very few of them, to my knowledge, have invested in actual brick and mortar businesses, although some have. And that has been seen to have also been a means through which they can launder money into these other countries.
Is it because, especially with regard to real estate, because we've seen, I'm not sure about the situation in Kampala, but with respect to Nairobi, the real estate market, you're seeing asset prices just go up completely out of line with fundamentals. Is it perhaps because it's so easy, at least in this part of the world, to literally just walk up? I know John-Allan has got a project somewhere in the middle of Lavington. I'll walk up with my $60,000, $100,000 in cash. Here you go. Give me the house.
That's exactly what the problem is here, because there's very little traceability in terms of what money was used to pay for what, especially in terms of real estate. That can literally happen anywhere across East Africa, perhaps with the exception of Tanzania and Rwanda, and possibly also Burundi. But Kenya and Uganda's fulcrums for the conflict, the movement of monies from that conflict, have been used repeatedly by South Sudanese elite to be able to purchase some of the biggest kinds of real estate. We're talking from farms to houses and that sort of thing, and buildings. In parts of Kampala, you'd find them owning 3, 4, 5, 6, 7-story buildings. The liquidity of their cash, or the manner in which how liquid they are, is something that just, I think, is too tempting for a lot of the people in that market.
But one of the other things that came out in your documentary is the fact that this stuff is happening, and repeatedly authorities in Kenya have been told, look, you've got to cut off the flow of cash from South Sudan. Your banking system can't be used to essentially launder this sort of thing. But time and time again, either they say, well, we can't do anything, our hands are tied, or they just deliberately choose not to do anything.
There's possibly 2 or 3 reasons for that. I think the first one is how beholden the political elite in the region are to each other. So they all have either business links or the kind of information on one another that could be ruinous to them reputation-wise. But I think the more important and more foundational reasons for why this continues to happen is that, by and large, Kenya and Uganda look at threats to their country in 2 ways. It's either a military securitized threat, or it's a political threat. So if a rebel leader does not present an immediate political threat to you and does not present an immediate security threat to you, then you are able to justify why the person is here, or at the very least ignore it, which is what has been happening in Kenya.
To what extent can sanctions by the central bank, or even just Kenyan banks, like say the top 10, saying, you know what, we're going to stop operations in South Sudan, more or less permanently, to what extent can that actually be effective in essentially drawing a line in the sand and saying, okay, South Sudanese cash, regardless of source, isn't going to come in here?
It can be effective to an extent, because that kind of money has to find its way into the formal economy. And so at some instance, one would assume that it would have to interact with the formal banking system. The reputational risk and the kind of risk in terms of linkages, because that's really what global financing and global banking is about. It's about linkages. the reputational risk and the actual, I'd call it a physical risk, a fiscal risk that banks have by having this kind of money swim in their resources might be such that their linkages with correspondent banks in the United States or anywhere where they hold their dollar reserves could be cut. And that's a massive reputational risk for them. They would be unable to trade. So the question, therefore, is the reputational risk more than the risk of doing business with people like the likes that we exposed?